You can no longer use this driveway. This is HOA property now, Karen shouted, pointing triumphantly at the 5 massive shipping containers blocking my garage entrance. I stood there, a mixture of rage and helplessness washing over me as neighbors gathered around to watch the drama unfold like some twisted street theater. The containers, industrial-sized metal boxes, formed an impenetrable wall across my driveway, their rusty exteriors gleaming mockingly in the afternoon sun. My car sat abandoned on the street, looking as out of place as I felt in this neighborhood. I'd called home for 5 years. "You can't just block access to my house," I protested, my voice strained but controlled. "I need to get my car in." Karen Wellington, our HOA president, crossed her arms and smiled, that particular smile reserved for someone who believes they hold all the power. Her perfectly highlighted bob haircut didn't move an inch as she shook her head. The board voted. "This access point is being reclaimed for community purposes. You'll need to use street parking from now on." What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I possessed a secret that would soon wipe that smug smile off her face and turn this entire neighborhood upside down. My name is Daniel Chen. For 5 years, I've lived quietly in Oakwood Estates, a picturesque suburban community with manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses. I'm a structural engineer who spends most days designing buildings that can withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. Ironically, nothing in my professional training prepared me for the storm that was Karen Wellington and the Oakwood Estates HOA. Every morning, I would back my modest sedan out of my garage, wave to Miss S. Patterson watering her award-winning roses, and drive to work. Every evening, I'd return, park in my garage, and enjoy the peaceful community I'd invested my life savings to join. I paid my HOA dues on time, kept my lawn at the regulation 5 inches, and never once questioned the increasingly restrictive community guidelines. That all changed last Tuesday. After a particularly exhausting day at work, I turned onto my street, only to find my driveway completely blocked by 5 enormous shipping containers. They stood like sentinels, denying me access to my own home. Confused and frustrated, I parked on the street, something technically forbidden by HOA rules after 7 p.m., and approached the metal barricade. A small crowd had gathered, including my next-door neighbor, Tom, who looked uncomfortable but remained silent. As I examined the containers, Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, expensive sunglasses perched on her head despite the setting sun. "What's going on here?" I asked, gesturing toward the containers. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Chen," Karen replied, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The HOA has determined that this access point would better serve the community as additional green space. We're planning a meditation garden." "But this is my driveway," I said, disbelief evident in my voice. "How am I supposed to access my garage?" "You're not," she stated flatly. "The board has voted to revoke your driveway privileges. Section 8, paragraph 12 of the HOA agreement gives us authority to reclaim common areas as needed." "My driveway isn't a common area," I protested. Karen's smile tightened. "Actually, according to our records, this access lane is HOA property. You've merely been permitted to use it until now." As if this confrontation wasn't humiliating enough, she handed me a bright orange envelope. "This is a citation for unauthorized street parking. First offense is a $150 fine. Second offense will be $300. I stood there, envelope in hand, watching as Karen walked away, her heels clicking on the pavement like a ticking time bomb. The neighbors slowly dispersed, avoiding eye contact, leaving me alone with 5 containers and a growing sense that this was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke to another orange envelope on my windshield. Vehicle creating visual obstruction, $200 fine. This was getting ridiculous. I photographed the citation and the containers blocking my driveway, then headed to work, my mind racing with potential solutions. During my lunch break, I called the HOA office and requested an emergency meeting. The secretary, Karen's niece, as I would later discover informed me that the next available slot was in 3 weeks. When I explained the urgency, she simply repeated, 3 weeks, Mr. Chen. The board has a very busy schedule. That evening, I returned home to find a tow truck parked beside my car. The driver, a burly man with a sympathetic expression, was preparing to hook up my vehicle. "Whoa, what are you doing?" I rushed over, keys jangling in my hand. HOA called for a tow. Said this vehicle is in violation of community guidelines. I managed to convince him to wait while I called Karen directly. After 6 rings, she answered with obvious annoyance. "Mr. Chen, the rules are clear. No street parking overnight. Your continued defiance is disrupting our community aesthetic. Karen, you've blocked my driveway with containers. Where exactly am I supposed to park?" "That's not the HOA's problem," she replied coldly. "Perhaps Oakwood Estates isn't the right community for someone unwilling to comply with our standards." I paid the tow truck driver $75 to leave without my car, another expense in this growing nightmare, and spent the evening researching HOA regulations and property laws. The next day brought more citations. Improper waste disposal, because my garbage can was visible from the street. I had no choice but to leave it there without driveway access. And unauthorized landscape modification because I had moved a decorative rock to help me step over a muddy patch created by the container's placement. By Friday, just 3 days after the containers appeared, I had accumulated over $700 in fines and received notice that my access to community amenities, the pool, tennis courts, and clubhouse had been suspended for persistent violations of community standards. My neighbor Tom finally approached me as I was collecting yet another citation from my windshield. He looked nervously over his shoulder before speaking. "Listen, Daniel, I'm sorry about what's happening. Karen's been doing this for years. The Johnsons in 403 had their fence torn down last year because it was apparently 2 inches taller than regulation. The Patel family moved out after Karen kept citing them for cooking odors that diminished property values. Why doesn't anyone stand up to her?" I asked. Tom's expression darkened. "Her husband is on the city council. Her brother-in-law is a judge. Most people just pay the fines or leave. It's easier that way." That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by HOA citations, property maps, and community bylaws. My eyes burned from hours of reading, but then I found it. A small detail in the original property documents that made my heart race with a mixture of disbelief and vindication. I needed to be absolutely certain. The next morning I visited the county records office, the moment it opened. The clerk, an elderly woman named Margaret, helped me locate the original property surveys and land deeds for Oakwood Estates. "This is interesting," she murmured, adjusting her glasses. "According to these records, that access lane wasn't included in the HOA common areas. It's actually part of your property, deeded separately from the HOA establishment." I stared at the documents, a plan forming in my mind. "Can I get certified copies of all of this?" Margaret smiled knowingly. "Someone giving you trouble, dear. You could say that. I'll have these ready in an hour. And good luck." The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for Monday evening at the community clubhouse. Despite my suspended privileges, I arrived early, certified documents in a leather portfolio under my arm. The room filled quickly apparently. Word had spread about the container situation, and attendance was higher than usual. Karen called the meeting to order precisely at 7 p.m., her gavel striking with unnecessary force. After covering routine business, she reached the agenda item labeled Enforcement Actions. "As many of you know," she began, her voice carrying across the silent room, "the board has taken steps to reclaim unauthorized access points for community enhancement. Mr. Chen's former driveway will soon be transformed into a meditation garden with a koi pond, improving property values for everyone." Several board members nodded in agreement. I noticed a few neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Now, regarding Mr. Chen's continued violations—" "Excuse me," I interrupted, standing up. I'd like to address the board on this matter. Karen's eyes narrowed. You're not on the agenda, Mr. Chen, and your privileges have been suspended due to outstanding violations. Actually, I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I believe this concerns everyone here. I moved to the front of the room, feeling dozens of eyes following me. Karen's face flushed. Security, please escort Mr. Chen out. A confused-looking man in a uniform half rose from his chair, but I quickly opened my portfolio and placed the documents on the table in front of Karen. Before anyone escorts me anywhere, I suggest you look at these certified county records. The room fell silent as Karen reluctantly examined the papers. Her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion, then to something resembling panic. These can't be, she stammered. I turned to address the room. For those who can't see, these are the original property deeds and surveys for Oakwood Estates. According to these legal documents, the driveway that has been blocked by containers is actually my private property. It was never part of the HOA common areas. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Furthermore, I continued, gaining confidence. The placement of those containers constitutes illegal trespassing and property damage. The fines issued against me are invalid, and I have grounds for significant legal action against both the HOA as an entity and board members as individuals. Karen's face had turned ghostly white. There must be some mistake, she insisted, shuffling through the papers with trembling hands. No mistake, Karen, I replied, echoing her words from days earlier. I've confirmed this with the county recorder's office. The land was originally part of a separate parcel that was never incorporated into the HOA agreement when Oakwood Estates was developed. Tom stood up from the audience. So you're saying Karen ordered containers placed on your private property without permission? That's exactly what I'm saying, I confirmed. And each day those containers remain, the liability grows. The board members looked at each other in panic. One of them, a retired attorney named Mr. Winters, examined the documents closely before whispering urgently to Karen. Karen's composure cracked completely. This meeting is adjourned, she announced, gathering the papers hastily. Actually, I said calmly, according to HOA bylaws, a meeting can only be adjourned by majority vote, and I believe we have some matters to resolve. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The containers were removed by emergency order that very night, with the HOA covering all expenses. Every fine issued against me was rescinded, with a formal apology included in the community newsletter. But I wasn't interested in revenge. When several neighbors suggested I sue the HOA for damages, I proposed an alternative, a complete restructuring of the HOA governance system. This isn't about punishing anyone, I explained at the emergency community meeting held the following week. It's about creating a fair system where no one person or small group can abuse their power. Within a month, we had implemented term limits for board members, transparent financial reporting, and a community review process for all major decisions. Karen resigned as president, selling her house shortly afterward and moving to a non-HOA community across town. The meditation garden was eventually built not on my driveway, but in a genuinely unused common area, with community input on its design. I often see neighbors there now actually meditating or simply enjoying the peaceful space. Tom, who had been the first to stand with me, was elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of fairness and transparency. Under his leadership, the community began to heal from years of divisive policies. One evening, as I was parking in my now accessible garage, Tom walked over with a bottle of wine. "You know," he said as we sat on my front porch, "you could have taken them for everything they had. The lawyer I consulted said you had a slam-dunk case for harassment and property rights violation." I shrugged, watching the sunset paint our neighborhood in warm golden light. Sometimes winning isn't about destroying your opponent. It's about creating something better from the conflict. Tom raised his glass. "To owning your own driveway and knowing when to fight." I smiled and clinked my glass against his. And to communities worth fighting for. The true victory wasn't just regaining access to my garage or seeing Karen's power dismantled. It was witnessing how quickly a community could transform when fear was replaced with fairness, when people remembered that neighbors should support rather than police each other. As for those 5 containers, the community voted to repurpose them as community garden beds, where families now grow vegetables and flowers together, a fitting symbol of how something meant to divide us ultimately brought us closer together. Have you ever faced an unreasonable HOA or someone who abused their authority? Share your story in the comments below by typing HOA and let us know how you handled it. Your experience might help someone else standing up for their rights. Remember to subscribe to Karen Chronicles for more stories about standing up to bullies and fighting for what's right. Because no one should be intimidated in their own home. Karen Chronicles, because no one should be bullied in their own home.